you.
All right, so I want to welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Mike Glenn. I'm the Franco-American president of Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. We've got our, of course, festival going on all weekend long. Some of you have been at some of the events. They kicked off on Wednesday night and will be going through Monday. But this is sort of the centerpiece, the keynote address of our festival every year. And it's a long-standing partnership between Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, this is our 37th annual festival, but with the Moses Greeley Parker Lecture Series, which has been going in Lowell since 1917. And it's something that's been a beautiful thing for us. It's sort of, like I said, it's how we present our keynote address for the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Festival every year. I want to recognize Mr. Dan Gutenplant over here, who is the director of the Moses Greeley Parker Lecture Series right now. And they do have their, particularly if you're local, they have their 2025, 2026 calendars of events up here. Please help yourself, feel free. We got some waters up here for anyone who might need a beverage. There are restrooms if you go out this door, and they're around the back. And you can enter or exit through the front or back over here. So with that said, without any further ado, I'm very happy to present our Parker lecturer for this year, a man who I would say needs no introduction, especially been here all weekend, so and participated in a number of the events, but this is the one we've all been looking forward to. So I'll just give it over to Mr. Hassan Melehy.
Melehy, yeah.
Melehy.
That's right. Yeah, and I've tried to go. You know, I'm not exactly ubiquitous at the festival, but maybe I'll close a few bars before I leave. All right, no, we don't want to joke too much about that. Oh, the bars in Lowell are really wonderful. I mean, the atmosphere. I love Lowell bars. I mean, partly because I'm going to talk about it in a second. I grew up an hour and a half south of here, and I mean, I just love New England bars. The varnish, the stain, the varnish, the pool table, and all of that. Midwest bars are pretty good too. I went to graduate school in Minnesota and Minneapolis. But anyway, okay, I'm honored to be speaking here. And I thank Lowell Celebrates Kerouac and the Parker Lecture Series for inviting me to give this lecture at this festival I've attended a few times, a wonderful celebration of a writer who many of us have loved for many years, in a city I've loved since I first visited in 2007. How many people here are from Lowell? Raise your hand if you're from Lowell. Okay, most people. Okay, I'm going to go into a bit of Lowell history, so bear with me. I suppose. Okay, yeah. And I mean, when I grew up in Connecticut, we did have a book when I was in 4th grade called This is Connecticut. That was the only time we read about Connecticut stuff. But we didn't read anything about my hometown in it. I had to look that up later, and it was just as weird as I thought it would be. But anyway, some people here are from one town away from where I grew up, and I will tell you later what I read about Scotland in this history. It made me and my younger brother laugh like crazy, but written in the late 19th century, because it was still the Scotland we knew 70 years later. But anyway, okay, so how many from nearby? How many people from nearby? Okay, yeah, so a lot of people, most people, but okay, I grew up about an hour and a half from here in northeastern Connecticut. Yes, a tiny town you might not have heard of. I just mentioned it, called Scotland. Has anyone heard of it? Okay, yes, yeah, of course. All right, yeah, you've heard of Scotland? Because when I left in 1980, there were about 900 people living there. It became very famous nationally that year, right after I left. I was 3,000 miles away, thinking I would never hear the name of that town again, and suddenly I heard it on the radio because they were having the first Ku Klux Klan rally north of the Mason-Dixon line since the 1920s there. And 40 years later, people would say, "Oh, you're from Scotland? Ku Klux Klan." And I found out, researching it just a few years ago, that David Duke himself came to Boston, looked around New England for the appropriate town, and found mine. Okay, anyway, so it has lots of woods and a fair amount of farmland. It had more farmland when I was a kid, but there still are a few family farms there. It sits between two mill towns that are like little versions of Lowell, Willimantic and Norwich. Some of you, yeah. Anyone from those towns? Yes, nearby again. Yeah, okay. Where textiles were made in the 19th century up through about the 1970s, and lots of other manufacturing. They were manufacturing centers. And like in Lowell, many people in those towns are descended from immigrants who came to this country for work. My hometown too, it was a place where if you worked in the mills and saved some money, you could buy a house and a little land. When I was in school, I knew a lot of kids whose parents or grandparents were immigrants. First, and their, first house. Polish, Czech, Russian, Irish, Italian, German, in a town of 900, okay? And the biggest group was the Franco-Americans. I mean, I went to school with for those of you who are from Quebec, I'm going to pronounce them as I heard them when I was a kid. Messier, Brousseau, Chartier, Gay and Lizzie, okay, to name just a few. There were many more than that in a school of, there were 300 kids in my high school, and I just gave you just a handful of the Québécois names. The French names are here. Morin, I just named another one. Okay, anyway. So, yeah, biggest group was the Franco-Americans, and like in Lowell, as Kerouac's novels tell us, yeah, just like in Lowell, okay, when I was a kid, many parents and grandparents spoke French, but in my generation, it was in my generation that only a few of the kids still spoke French. They're the ones whose families still maintained close ties to Quebec. And I think most people here know Kerouac's first language was French and that he learned English when he went to school. His parents were French speakers, originally from Quebec, and the family belonged to Lowell's large Franco-American community. During his lifetime, he saw fewer and fewer people in his hometown speaking French. Yeah, the newspaper, yeah, L'Étoile of Lowell, which was one of the great Franco-American newspapers, it went to 3 times a week in 1950, and by one of those weird historical accidents, it stopped publishing the week On the Road came out. Yeah, so there was a paper in Worcester that went till 1978, but that was because Wilfred Beaulieu never wanted to stop writing editorials against Assumption College for abandoning its commitment to French as a first language. So, so the people, he saw fewer and fewer people in his hometown speaking French. They were leaving behind the place they'd come from or where their ancestors had come from. They were leaving behind its memory. And one of his motives for becoming a writer was to be sure people remembered their immigrant heritage. One of his childhood nicknames, as I'm sure people here know, was Memory Babe, because it seemed like he remembered everything. He remembered what had happened to the people he repeatedly said he belonged to, the French Canadians or the Franco-Americans. I think he used that term only a few times, Franco-Americans, Jean-Christophe, I think. I think once. I think you pointed that out. He only uses it once, but it's, yeah. So French Canadians, and I say Franco-Americans, some people have told me that French Canadian is somewhat offensive. I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that, but yes?
Well, I can just say myself,
yeah.
As a native-born Llewellian, French-Canadian on
yeah.
both sides, I had never really heard anybody around here call themselves Franco-Americans.
Yeah.
I grew up into adulthood saying that I was French-Canadian.
Okay,
so
yeah.
It was like a transition. It was something that I think people within the culture created when they were trying to indicate that they weren't immediately from Quebec, but that they were immigrants in the way that Irish Americans, Italian Americans.
You do find it as far back as the early 20th century, and in Willimantic, Connecticut, there still is a Franco-American club. And that's been around for a very long time. And let me see, when I grew up, people said we're French. And my mother, who came from Europe, said, they're French-Canadian. I said, my friend Mitchell Dominic's French. She said, no, he's French-Canadian. It was like that. But people said we're French. But actually, we're French, and there were reasons for that. Okay, anyway, back to, yeah. So Lowell is an excellent place to learn about Franco-American history, thanks to Dr. Mercedes Baillargeon, who did her PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I teach, and who has taught at UMass Lowell since 2022. You have the Franco-American, Digital Archive in connection with the Center for Lowell History. And I believe Kerouac would have been thrilled about this. And if David Amram were here, I would ask him if Jack were thrilled about it. If Jack would be thrilled about it, I'm sure David would say yes. David's doing a rehearsal right now, and I hope all of you come to his concert this evening. And let's see, Professor Baillargeon is on sabbatical right now. She's in France, but let's thank her long distance for the Franco-American Digital Archive. And I will tell her, we're connected on social media. She's actually posted a couple of likes on my Lowell photos today. So, all right, yeah, so, all right. I will tell her, yes. I'll convey it. Okay. So, all right, and so back to Kerouac. For Franco-American history, as I did my best to show in the book I published in 2016, copies here, we'll talk about that later, it's important for understanding who Kerouac was and why he wrote. The French-speaking people of Canada, almost 1 million of whom came to the United States between 1840 and 1930, throughout that time often migrated. Their ancestors had migrated from France, mostly in the 17th and 18th centuries. Just as many English people came to North America looking for opportunities in farming and fur trading, among other pursuits, so did people from France. But Britain ended up dominating the eastern part of North America. We know what happened to the 13 British colonies in 1776, but not long before that, the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763. A battle for the domination of the eastern part of North America, and the British won. The decisive battle was in 1759 at the Plains of Abraham, which at the time was just outside Quebec City, and since then has become part of it. The British General Wolfe defeated the French General Montcalm. When the war ended in 1763, the Treaty of Paris ceded all of French Canada to Britain. So the French of Quebec became British subjects and, at best, second-class citizens. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham was a major event for Kerouac. As many of you know, Jack wrote hundreds of pages in French, most of which he kept hidden away and didn't even tell anyone about. Little of it was published until very recently, and we have an audience member who's responsible for that publication, just about single-handedly responsible for that publication, J.C. Cloutier, professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Whose work in reconstructing manuscripts from Kerouac's archive and translating his idiosyncratic French is stunning. But snippets of French turn up in Jack's novels and poems. The longest passage in French in the novels he published in his lifetime is in Dr. Sachs. His great novel about Lowell, which Bill Walsh and Kurt Phaneuf will show you on Sunday with their Dr. Sachs tour called The Ghost of the Pawtucketville Night. If you've read Dr. Sachs, you know the reference. In Dr. Sachs, Jack mentions the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, when Quebec fell to British rule and the French of Canada lost their direct ties to France. The novel is narrated by Jack Deluoz, Kerouac's alter ego, and Jack's Uncle Mike is speaking. He says, this is the English translation Kerouac provides after the French, Napoleon was a great man. Also the General Montcalm at Quebec, even though he lost. So besides the defeated hero of the French and Indian War, Uncle Mike starts with Napoleon, the arch enemy of the British Empire, himself defeated by them at Waterloo. Uncle Mike tells Jack about those fallen heroes to explain how sad the Deluoz family is. Chained by God to pain, maybe to hell. Sad because they're condemned to wander. He also mentions the first Deluoz ancestor in North America, Baron Louis-Alexandre Lebris de Kerouac, de Deluoz. I was corrected on my pronunciation. I kind of default to French because of the ruler my French teacher would hit me with when I was 12. No, I'm just joking about that. No, but I did learn correct pronunciation. So whenever I see a French word, I just go into French. But I was corrected yesterday that I think according to Kurt Hemmer, he heard Allen Ginsberg say that Kerouac said he pronounced it Deluoz. Well, I mean, exactly. You don't say Kerouac when you speak in English. You say Kerouac. So rather than saying Deluoz, you say Deluoz. Fine. An army the Baron Louis-Alexandre Lebris de Deluoz, I'll say it in French that time, an army officer came to fight during the French and Indian War, named after Louis-Alexandre Lebris de Kerouac. Jack's wrong guess, which he actually did get from the Québécois genealogical encyclopedia published in the 19th century, an army officer who came to fight during the French and Indian War. Okay, yeah, so he actually guessed it right a few years earlier because that was determined by the Kerouac families who the first ancestor was. And I dug into the archives and actually found that the first person he identified was the right one. He went to the second one, I believe, because he wanted to believe he had noble ancestry, a baron, and a guy who came to America as a military officer just before the French Revolution. I think I'm pretty sure that's what he was thinking, okay? So, French Revolution, 1789, yes. So, in this event, after this event, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, that made them wanderers from the mother country, France, starting in about 1840, the massive French-Canadian migration happened. As I mentioned, almost 1 million people, almost half the population of Quebec, over almost 100 years, wandered to the United States. This started right after another major event, the Lower Canada Rebellion of 1837-1838. The French of Canada, Lower Canada as it was called, which is what the British called it because they looked down on it. The French of Canada rebelled against their British rulers, against the terrible treatment they received. And the British rulers won. And they took severe measures in response. The British Governor General of Canada, Lord Durham, wrote a 300 and some page report on the rebellion and what to do about it. You can get all these things on Google Books. Doing research these days is just so wonderful. You can find just about anything you're looking for. His conclusion, this was a racial problem, not a political problem, not a problem of principle, a problem of race. Yes, in the 19th century, the British considered the French of Canada to be a different race, different ancestry, different language. And what's more, an inferior race because they were cut off from their homeland. Well, whose fault was that? Another 19th century idea that a person's race was tied to the soil they lived on. His solution was, in his own words, obliterating the nationality of the French Canadians. They had to be transformed into English people. They had to stop speaking French and forget their homeland. He actually did say the Catholic priests were on the British side, so they were okay. That the difference in religion wasn't a big deal because the French Catholic priests generally supported the British, so they were good. His solution was he thought this was doing them a favor, elevating from their inferiority. Okay, this was his resonant characterization of the French of Canada. They are a people with no history and no literature. Okay, I can't say for certain whether Kerouac knew all these details. Some of them certainly, because Franco-American, French-Canadian history was taught in the French language parochial schools, which he attended until age 11. But he certainly felt what Lord Durham had said, no history and no literature. Or rather, literature and history erased. And from a young age, he was determined to remedy that, to memorialize his hometown, the town we're in right now, with his first novel, The Town and the City, published in 1950, then with the three great Lowell novels, published in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And he also memorialized many immigrants of Lowell, along with their descendants and those who wandered still further across America. What brought French-Canadian immigrants to Lowell? Work in the factories, yes, but what was the advantage of coming here into other mill towns around New England? Economic conditions. They were poorly treated by the British rulers. There were strong prejudices against them in the English-speaking population, effectively racial prejudices. Many French speakers in Quebec were farmers. Anyone who has farmed or lived around farms, as we did in northeastern Connecticut, knows that yields and profits vary considerably from year to year. Weather, field conditions, the economy, all sorts of things. So sometimes you have to borrow money. Who owned the banks in Canada? The British. And there was a severe and widespread discrimination against the French-speaking population. If a French speaker in Quebec tried to get a bank loan, it was unlikely they succeeded. And incidentally, just an aside, it was in response to that I'm sorry, I'm blanking on Jean-Christophe, the guy who founded the credit unions.
Desjardins?
Yes, Desjardins. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's yes, and Thank you, yeah. And well, he founded the credit unions in Quebec and also simultaneously across the border, and it was a solution to be able to make the French autonomous again. And this was around the turn of the 20th century. Curiously enough, he was a Federalist in Canada. He thought that Quebec should integrate into English-speaking Canada, but privately in a letter he said, you know, I think the nationalist idea there might be something there. But he actually effectively promoted it. And yes, that's why you still have a Jeanne d'Arc credit union. And I heard yesterday that people would say the Church of Saint Jean Baptiste. I'm really happy that you say you don't say the Jeanne d'Arc credit union, which you could say. I'm sure some people do. Okay, anyway. So when farmers needed to borrow money, they often turned to usurers, more recently known as loan sharks, who charged up to 80% interest. So many farms failed and many people were left in extreme poverty. In Visions of Gerard, a great Lowell novel, I'll say it again, Jack gives a beautiful description of the devastation among the peasants of Quebec, the sense of being far from home with very little. He describes the scene around the birth of Jacques Duluos's father, Émile Alcide Duluos, in Saint-Hubert, on the St. Lawrence River, northeast of Quebec City. Here it is, and I'll quote a few lines. Forlorn, the plains of Abraham, the winds bring plague dusts from all the way to Baffin and Hudson, and where roads end and the Iroquois Arctic begins, the utterly hopeless place to which the French came when they came to the New World, the hardness of the Indians they must have embrothered to be able to settle so and have them for conspirators in the rebellion against contrarious, potent, churly England. Winds all the way from the nostril of the moose. I had to include that. Coarse, rough, tough needs in potato fields, a little fold of honey and fleshed is being presented to the holy water for life. Yeah, I mean, this is the winds from the nostril. A newborn baby has a little fold of flesh. We love Jack because all of his writing is poetry. Notice that he mentions the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and he mentions the Lower Canada Rebellion, the rebellion against Contrarius, both of them. The Plains of Abraham, and then the Contrarius. He certainly knew about these events. Was very aware of it, So what was going on south of the border? Well, we know what was going on south of the border. Founded in 1826, the first town, bear with me if you had this in high school, okay, or elementary school. The first town in the United States, founded specifically as an industrial town, incorporated as a city in 1836. From the start, then, Lowell's manufacturers sought labor. And a few years later, after the Lowell, all of these things happened at the same time, coincidentally. After the Lower Canada Rebellion and the impoverishment of much of the French-speaking population of Quebec, they found very cheap labor. They sent recruiters north of the border, and many, many people were willing to come. Over the next few decades, whole communities set up churches and Catholic schools in Lowell and all over New England. Every mill town near where I grew up in Connecticut had big French-speaking communities until the 1950s. I learned once that Willimantic hit 60%. In Putnam, 90% French-speaking, if you can believe. These are towns in northeastern Connecticut, if you know them, which is kind of astounding. There's just the number. I mean, you'd have to go to find towns in the United States that are that non-English speaking. You'd have to go to California and Texas nowadays. But that's what it was like. So yeah, at the peak of the migration between 1900 and 1920, just before Jack was born, Massachusetts was about 13%, statewide, 13% French-speaking. The French-speaking population of Lowell hit about 20 to 25% or so. That's the figure I've come across. The Franco-Americans of New England were proud of who they were. The churches and schools they set up were the main institutions by which they maintained their language and their identity as a people. That's a big reason why Jack always said he was a devoted Catholic, even during and after his deep and very intelligent forays into Buddhism. The huge difference between the way immigrants are treated now and the way they were treated through most of the 19th century is that there were virtually no laws governing immigration until 1875. You could just cross the border, come in on a ship, anything. As industry grew in the United States, immigrants arrived as contributors. Even after 1875, there were few restrictions, except against the Chinese, who were said, get ready for it, to be stealing jobs from Americans. People from, we keep hearing that, don't we? Okay. People from Quebec were free to cross the border, but that didn't mean they were well liked, or that any immigrants were. I think we've all heard the slurs against Italians, Poles, and Jews, most of which started in the 19th century. There was also plenty of hatred for Franco-Americans. They were famously called the Chinese of the Eastern States. By Carol Wright, a Massachusetts labor official, later the first U.S. Commissioner of Labor, in his report, Uniform Hours of Labor. Curiously, he was not what we would now think of having all the values of a typical raging racist. He was in favor of higher pay and shorter hours for workers when no such laws existed. No minimum wage, no limit on work weeks. He was in favor of those things, but he believed the Franco-Americans were willing to accept low wages and so drove down the wages for other workers, which was also said to be true of Chinese. Historical studies have shown that's actually not true of Chinese. It was just said about them, and then it was said about the Franco-Americans. Wright's declaration, the declaration caused a big uproar among the French Canadians of Massachusetts. Community members went to the legislature to straighten out the record. They said, among other things, this is a quote from the legislative proceedings, "We are a white race." They thought they had to straighten that part of the record out. To Wright's credit, he listened to them and then publicly apologized for the slur. As late as 1923, the year after Jack was born, there was a controversy involving the French Canadians in Rhode Island. A new state law required all schools, even the private Catholic schools, to teach in English. The law mainly targeted the Franco-American schools, which for half of each school day taught the kids in French, so that community members would keep speaking it perfectly. Members of the community lobbied the state to change the laws. A prominent journalist, Robert C. Dexter, writing in a national magazine, curious in the Nation, okay, this was, and we understand that as a progressive magazine, writing in a national magazine, accused the Franco-Americans of stirring the fires of race hatred. In 1923, okay? Yes, race hatred. That dangerous race, the French Canadians, so called even in Jack's lifetime. And this followed up, just a little aside, I don't want to, well, okay, we're fine on time, I think. Dexter, though he wrote for The Nation, a progressive magazine, he was a follower of Madison Grant, who in 1915 published the great book on white supremacy for the 20th century, The Passing of the Great Race, timed, I don't think accidentally, with the release of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, in which he compares the French of Canada to the Negroes of the South. That's what he says. And he says, because he talks about them being working in the fields and lazy, and also having no connection to the soil. See, and this is the thing, because that was one of the things white supremacy predicated on. The idea of race, you've heard the term blood and soil. The idea of if your race was strong if they were tied to the soil. African Americans supposedly weren't tied to the soil. Well, again, whose fault was that, you know? But Grant said the same thing about the French of Canada, and Dexter was following this, so the fires of race hatred. They thought it was a terrible thing that Americans continued, even wanted to continue speaking a foreign language, never mind, because the point was to learn English and French equally. But no, we're not even going to let them speak French. So unwelcome, scorned, far removed from the places they'd come from, being told they couldn't speak their own language. In a letter Jack wrote in 1950 to journalist Yvonne Lemaitre, also a Lowell native, a graduate of Lowell High, he describes it like this: that horrible homelessness all French Canadians abroad in America have. As I said earlier, he felt this uprootedness and this scorn. A big reason for his strong identification with other migrant groups across America, especially poorer migrants, people who had to work hard for low pay, and strongly with African Americans. Hence his fascination with the road, with going on the road, with writing a novel called On the Road. The road is all about migration. Migration from somewhere and migration to somewhere. Jack's road starts in Lowell. Where the Road Begins, as he titled a short story he wrote during his college years, which is in Atop in Underwood. Is Paul Marion here?
Nope.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, anyway.
Conspicuous absence.
Yes, I guess so, yeah. Yes, so anyway, this is a great collection of Kerouac's early writings that Paul Marion edited. And let's thank Paul.
We love Paul.
I love Paul too, yeah.
Poet laureate.
Yeah. A great citizen, yes. He's also one of the founders of LCK. So let's thank everyone with the LCK for that, okay? That was improvised. I have it written into the talk at the end, so I'm going to say it again, okay? Back to Lowell. Okay, for most of its 200-year history, Lowell has been a city of immigrants. Besides the French Canadians, Jack knew people from many groups: Irish, Italian, Greek, East European, Asian, among others. This is how Jack depicted Lowell in the town and the city. But in his first novel, he disguised it slightly. He called it Galloway. I won't try to guess why he picked exactly this name, except to say he took the low in Lowell and embellished it with 2 other syllables, one of which is Gaul, which sounds kind of like the Gauls or the French, maybe. Okay, I just took a guess. All right, so I'll guess a little further. The word way, the last syllable of Galloway, means road, as in freeway or highway, or Patriot Way or Harmony Way or Solomon Way. There are many ways in Lowell. So going away is going on the road. And a lot of what the town and the city is going away. It's the proverbial great American novel. It's about a large family, the Martins. It has football, diners, a typical New England town, swimming in the river, teenage love, New York City, college, small business, jazz. It has everything. The attack on Pearl Harbor that results in a lot of young men enlisting and young women contributing in military or industrial roles. Galloway is full of mills, the Merrimack flows through it, and the population is distinctly descended from immigrants. The mother of the Martin family, Marguerite, is from a French-Canadian family in New Hampshire. The Courbet family, like the 19th century French painter Gustave Courbet, I don't have Jack's word on that, but it can't be otherwise, Gustave Courbet. The father, the Impressionists regarded as their main forebears. So Jack was always interested, any avant-garde he could attach himself to. Jack said in the same letter from 1950 that he chose the name Martin because it could be either English or French. One of the father, George Martin's good friends, is Wong Lee, who runs a Chinese restaurant, and we hear of many other French Canadian, Greek, and Irish people. In short, Galloway, Lowell, is a town of immigrants, hardworking immigrants trying to live the American dream. When a train comes rumbling through, it's not just any train, but most often the Montreal train, a reminder of how close French-speaking Canada is, the place where so many of the town's residents or their parents or grandparents migrated from. And over the book's 500 pages, what does the Martin family do? They migrate all over the country, then across the Atlantic and Pacific for the war. Joe Martin drives a truck up and down the East Coast. Francis Martin goes to Harvard, then New York. Peter Martin goes to Philadelphia on a football scholarship at the University of Pennsylvania, where J.C. Cloutier teaches. Liz moves to Hartford, then Detroit, and it keeps going. Kerouac writes about the outbreak of the Second World War. The great wartime wanderings of Americans were just beginning. The Town and the City is a novel of migration. Migration is something American, something that belongs to this nation of immigrants, so I can't help that one. Book covered by another writer from Massachusetts, from a family of recent Irish immigrants, whose name was also Jack. His initials were J.K., maybe he used the F to be sure people didn't mistake him for Kerouac. Who was more important in 1962? We know, don't we? Yes. One of Jack's other Lowell novels, probably my favorite of his books, Dr. Sachs, where he calls Lowell Lowell, is also about the immigrants who live here. He wrote the first version of Dr. Sachs in Mexico City in 1952, not long after he wrote the famous scroll manuscript of On the Road. It's a kaleidoscope of a book, all about remembering what might be forgotten and discovering hidden connections between many different people and places. In the opening pages, we hear about people named Leo Martin, Joe Plouffe, sunny alberges, Franco-Americans. And we hear about a friend of the young Jack Kerouac, G.J. Rigopoulos, a kid from a Greek family, and about Chin Lee, a Chinese man who runs a popular restaurant in downtown Lowell. And we hear about fantastical figures, Count Condu, who came to Lowell from Budapest. We hear about Dr. Sachs himself, who has traveled all over North America and South America and many other places. We hear about Native Americans. As I said a few minutes ago, we hear about the conquest of North America by the French and British empires. In short, it's a novel about migration. Migration is what makes Lowell what it is, what makes America what it is, and what makes the world what it is. Isn't that what On the Road is about? Going on the road is following the path of migration, the road Jack knew his own family had taken from Québec, and that he had taken elsewhere in the country, and that in On the Road, Sal Paradise and a bunch of friends take to Mexico. All over the country, his narrator, his alter ego Sal Paradise, meets migrants. There's the long section in the Central Valley of California where Sal falls in love with Terry, part of a large community of Chicano and Chicana migrant farm workers. Sal talks about tension between the Okies, white migrant farm workers from Oklahoma who were devastated by the dust storms there, and the Mexicans. This tension is an echo of the time when Anglo-Americans in Massachusetts thought the Franco-Americans were stealing their jobs. Sal says that the Okies thought I was Mexican. Of course, they thought I was Mexican, of course. And in a way, and again, there's that word, a way, in a way, like on the road, I am. Sal can say that because he remembers when Italian-Americans, Sal's Italian-American, full name Salvatore Paradiso, he remembers when they were treated with hostility. And of course, this is Jack's memory of when his own people, the Franco-Americans, were ill-treated and even hated as supposedly non-white people. But despite how much Sal loves Terry and how close he feels to her community, he moves on. He can move on because he can pass for a white American, because he's a man when that kind of travel would be dangerous for a woman by herself. And because the status of his own community, and because the status his own community has achieved in the United States gives him modest financial means. As he says, he moves on because he has white ambitions. Ambitions to be in the upper echelons of American society. Sal knows, and Jack knew, that he was a tourist in the places he went. He could look at people and things, learn something about them, but not become a real part of them before moving on. But that doesn't stop him from appreciating all that migrants bring to the places he goes. Sal hears jazz as the music of migration. On the Road, in one of the great concert scenes in On the Road, one of them is in San Francisco in 1948, when Sal and Dean Moriarty, based on Neil Cassidy, I think everybody knows that, go to a nightclub to hear the great musician Slim Gaillard, a migrant himself who might have been born in Cuba. Sal says, Slim goes mad and grabs the bongos and plays tremendous rapid Cubana beats and yells crazy things in Spanish, in Arabic, in Peruvian dialect, in Egyptian, every language he knows, and he knows innumerable languages. So Slim Gaillard plays music that's a crossroads of migration. Sal, Dean, and a few of their friends get a good look at migration when, toward the end of On the Road, they drive south of another North American border into Mexico. On this trip, they're hardly migrants themselves, since they're white Americans with a car in good shape and enough money to travel around before returning to the United States. But they're following the paths of migration that were central to how Jack imagined North America and the world. In fact, Sal is aware that many Mexicans see them as tourists, people who can come and go freely without getting more than a superficial idea of what's in front of them. The indigenous Mexicans they pass, Sal believes, see them as self-important money bag Americans on a lark in their land. He tries to see himself through their eyes and through the power of his imagination to see past his own superficial grasp. This is a breathtaking passage in On the Road, which Kurt quoted at some length yesterday. A sentence that, yes, is Kurt Hemmer, a wonderful Kerouac scholar also over here. He's visiting from Chicagoland, Kurt and Aaron Hemmer. This is a breathtaking passage on the road, a sentence that keeps moving and winding like a road, like the scroll he wrote the initial draft of the book on. Here it is. Not like driving across Carolina or Texas or Arizona or Illinois, but like driving across the world and into the places where we would finally learn ourselves among the fellahin Indians of the world, the essential strain of the basic primitive, wailing humanity that stretches in a belt around the equatorial belly of the world from Malaya, the long fingernail of China, to India, the great subcontinent, to Arabia, to Morocco, to the self-same deserts and jungles of Mexico, and over the waves to Polynesia, to mystic Siam of the yellow robe, and on around, so that you hear the same mournful wail by the rotted walls of Cadiz, Spain, in Castilian Cadiz, that you hear 12,000 miles around in the depths of Benares, the capital of the world. So in The Migrant People of Mexico, Sal casts a glimpse through his imagination, of course. I mean, this is, Kerouac this is a vision he's having, that Sal is having, and Kerouac also. I mean, he wrote these very closely on the basis of his own experience. He catches a glimpse of an immense global network of migration across the Americas, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. This is where, he says, the Americans will learn who they really are in the wider world, because these are migrants, the vital population of the wider world. Jack uses one of his favorite words, fellahin, the Arabic word for peasants, which he borrows from the early 20th century German philosopher Oswald Spengler. Spengler was famous in Europe and the United States for his 2-volume book called The Decline of the West, which Jack read in his early 20s on the recommendation of his close friend Sebastian Sampras, Tony and Jim Sampras's very smart uncle, who unfortunately died during the Second World War. By the way, let's thank Tony and Jim, 2 very smart guys who are doing lots for Jack's. Most people come across the fact that Burroughs really loved this and gave it to Jack and Alan, but he had first heard about it from Sebastian, whose uncle Charles, who wrote for The Sun, and all the Sampras that I've met are really well read. Okay, so this goes back generations, I think. He had a copy. It was a widely selling book. I mean, this was when books of philosophy made it to the bestseller lists, and across Europe and the United States. It influenced the way a lot of people thought about the world and the West. So I'll just say a few words about it. Spengler attracted so much interest for his explanation of how civilizations work, specifically how they are born and grow, and then how they decline and die. He saw civilizations as similar to living organisms. He thought the West, after centuries of glory, was on its way out. That's a very brief summary of his very long book, his 2 very long books, and of course, it's impossible to summarize all he says in over 1,000 pages. And I'm not going to venture to say whether he was right, but because he offered such a thoroughgoing explanation, well, this is how the world works. We all want to know that, His work attracted wide interest, so it was consequential to the ways many people thought about the world and the West's role in it, including Jack, Sebastian Sampras, and William Burroughs. But I'll only say what Spengler meant by the word fellahin, and I'll talk about the quite different meaning that Jack gave it in his writings. Spengler saw civilizations as gigantic beings, empires or multiple empires like the Greeks and the Romans, or the Chinese, classical civilization, we call it, the Chinese in their very long history, or the West starting in the last 600 years or so. Civilizations start out as rural. He says they all do. This is their childhood. Peasants work the land and start building things, eventually towns and cities, also technologies. Once they grow to a certain point, like human beings, they hit their peak and start to age. Part of aging is losing their values and their structure. And a different type of peasant comes into existence, the kind that Spengler calls fellahin. He got the Arabic word from studies of the decline of ancient Egypt during and after the Roman Empire. When the Arabs moved from the Middle East across Africa in the 7th century, they encountered these wanderers, so hence the term fellahin, the Arabic word. According to Spengler, when all civilizations get old, they have fellahin, groups of people who wander aimlessly with no purpose or values, who create nothing. Spengler saw nations as the driving force of civilization. Strong nations that can influence a lot of other nations, strong nations that can form empires. As Spengler saw it, Fellahin are the opposite of a nation, no unity and no collective strength. And since, according to Spengler, what distinguishes the West among all the civilizations the world has so far seen is its drive to unlimited spatial expansion, the Fellahin of the West are scattered throughout the world. But Jack saw it otherwise. The indigenous people of Mexico had survived the fall of the Aztec Empire and then seen the Spanish Empire come and go. And now it's the era of the American Empire, which Jack was fully aware of. Jack's own people had seen the French Empire fall in North America, followed by the British eventually pulling out. And he saw the Fellahin, the wanderers when these empires fell, himself among them, his family among them, as the true creators. They were outsiders to the new civilization, so they could always bring something new to it. He saw this as true of the indigenous peoples of North America, in the relatively new nations here. He saw this as true of the French Canadians. He saw this as true of the African Americans. And all over the world, he saw migrant peoples, the Fellahin, as essential to civilization, its true creative force. So migrants, as Jack sees them, are the true citizens of the United States, of all the countries in the Americas and of the globe. They belong wherever they go and make each place what it is, even if some people refuse to acknowledge it or tell them they don't belong. Yeah, we don't want any communists running New York, any un-Americans. Yes, yeah. Throughout, okay, I mean,
Socialist.
well, I mean, Trump actually calls him a communist, but I mean, what we're hearing now, you can find. I mean, this is echoing things that were said almost verbatim a very long time ago, and it's just continuing echoes of things many of us, I mean, that we've heard in America many times before. So, throughout On the Road, that's what we readers see. Also in the Lowell novels, the working people of Lowell, the many people whose families came from elsewhere, make it what it is. And in later novels, Jack describes traveling further. The Dharma Bums takes place mostly in California, with forays around the country to North Carolina, and into Mexico, but it's also about discovering Buddhism, which originally comes from Asia and which Jack thought could challenge the hierarchies of Western civilization. In Lonesome Traveler, he takes us on his wanderings back to Mexico, then across the Atlantic to Morocco, then France, then England. And in Desolation Angels, he takes us around the United States to Mexico and to Morocco. In all these places, he finds people he calls Fellahin, wanderers who live a full life that doesn't have much to do with the confines of nations and governments. In Morocco, Jacques Delouaz observes that diplomats, the official representatives of nations, are only interested in private limousines, hotel restaurants, parties in the suburbs, an endless phony rejection in the name of democracy in quotation marks of all that's pith and moment of every land. Pith and moment. The diplomat's version of democracy, I don't think he's rejecting democracy so much as the diplomat's version of it. The idea of, we're exporting democracy, we're doing these people a favor. You know, the diplomat's version of democracy, as opposed to, I mean, oftentimes you have democratically elected presidents. Well, we're going to show them how democracy really works. See, I mean, I think he's criticizing, I think it's along those lines. The diplomat's version of democracy doesn't make much contact with the people who make countries what they are and who make the world what it is. So, as you might have guessed from my name, I'm from an immigrant family. My father came from Egypt and my mother came from Holland. My father won the contest, I guess, over who got to pick the kids' names. Yeah. I never asked them how they decided it, who got to pick them, because we all got Arabic names. Well, my older brother got the middle name Vincent after my mother's favorite Dutch painter. I don't speak Arabic. Like many children of immigrants like Jack, I'm pretty distant from the places my parents come from, even though I feel those places every day. I'm not pronouncing Fellahin correctly. I'd have to practice, and then I'd have to say it carefully. Are there any Arabic speakers here, by the way, to illustrate the correct pronunciation of Fellahin? When I spoke at Penn, we had a native of Egypt in the audience, and I asked her to pronounce it, and it was just, It was like hearing my grandmother and uncles say the word. It was like I shuddered, you know. The way Jack says he did when he read Yvonne Lemaitre's review. Just when Jerry said that at Penn, I was, whoa, that's in my bones, that word, that language. It can be in your bones and you still might not know it. Okay, I'm mentioning this because I think all of us who love Jack's books feel like he's saying something directly to us, something personal and almost secret, right in our ear. He worked for a long time on being able to do that. When I first read On the Road at age 20, one of the first things I noticed was that Sal Paradise was Italian-American. He speaks Italian with his aunt. And when I soon read more of Jack's books, I found out he was from a Franco-American family, that he spoke French with his mother, and that he sometimes wrote in French. In my hometown, the other kids whose parents or grandparents spoke with accents were the French-Canadian kids. Like me, Jack was deeply aware of being from an immigrant family and living among people of immigrant heritage. And because he made these part of America and showed how connected America is to the rest of the world, he made me feel more American. So with Jack, I'd like to celebrate Lowell as a city that has always been home to immigrants, and to our shared country as a place where all immigrants should be able to live happily. So let's celebrate together here in Lowell, where we celebrate Jack. So thanks to everyone for coming to this lecture, and thanks to everyone for coming to Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. And let's give another special thanks to the organizers of this wonderful festival, and to Dan Gutenplan of the Green Lectures. And let's thank each other, all the people who've come to Lowell to celebrate Kerouac, all the people who make this festival what it is. Let's thank each other.
All right.
Okay, come on. If anyone's interested, I have copies of my book on Kerouac for sale here. It's going to sound expensive to people who don't buy academic books, but it was as low as I could go on the price. I also write poetry. The next event I'm going to is the Poetry Open Mic at the Worthen House, hosted by Cliff Whalen and emceed by Dan Bacon. Thank you very much. Sure, we can have, yes, yeah.
This question is just out there.
Sure.
With anyone who might want to know. But when I was growing up in Lowell, we had neighbors who owned a record company. They were French Canadian. There were a lot of children. We went to a lot of birthday parties there.
Yeah.
And all throughout the house were graphic images of swords going into hearts,
Yeah.
and blood and suffering.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could say anything about
That's the Carillon Sacré-Cœur.
the strain of Catholicism.
Well, the Carillon Sacré-Cœur flag was what was actually, it's a, I'd have to Google to find an image. I don't have that one with me. I actually, I showed an image of that when I lectured on the university 8 years ago, and Roger Brunel asked me if I had that slide. I actually found a Carillon Sacré-Cœur flag on Amazon, this big, and I sent it to him. Because he had said the Pledge of Allegiance to that flag every single day he was in school in French Canadian, the Carillon Sacré-Cœur. And that is named for the defeat of Quebec, because Jean-Christophe, could you perhaps, I think, because the battle that was lost, okay, yes, it was during they still held parts of upstate New York, the French, and the first French first French installation to fall was Fort Carillon, which became Fort Ticonderoga. And so it was an emblem of the fall of Quebec and the loss and its Catholicism. So there's this very long narrative in Quebec history of having fallen in North America, but of having made a virtue out of the falling through being even stauncher Catholics. I mean, there was a whole narrative that God had ordained the fall of Quebec just before the French Revolution. No accident with the dates, because he meant to save French Catholicism, the real medieval Catholicism. People said things like this. I've quoted some of these speeches and writings in my book from the atheists who took power in France after the Revolution. And then to go on the road, this was actually said in the 19th century, and spread Catholicism throughout North America, hence Saint Jean Baptiste Saint John the Baptist on the St. Lawrence. Okay, so yeah, that's I think why they had all of those images. That was a super important image in French Canadian. That was the flag of French Canadians. That was the flag of French Canadians in America. The Cavillon Sacré-Cœur.
A sign at the foot of the Stations of the Cross.
Yeah.
That said a true pilgrim will go up on their knees.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It instructed you to go on your knees.
Yeah, and Jack reports that in
All the
Dr.
way up the
Sachs.
stairs.
Yeah. So I'm going to just Google quickly the Cavillon. It's not hard to find. It's still a pretty widespread image. Oh wait, okay, I'm going to have to do a screen sharing of some kind here. No, okay. There we go. Is it, Tony, is that familiar? Yeah, that's the Cavillon Sacré-Cœur flag.
True there. The span.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, yeah, so that's the, yes. Mm-hmm.
Did Kerouac's opinions about immigration were they in any way influenced by the events of World War II? Japanese, Germans? Did he ever write anything explicitly about that? Maybe in letters.
Yeah, he does mention, he uses a slur for the Japanese in his passage, the famous passage in On the Road, with the Lilac Evenings passage in the Dender. He says he wished he were
Poor overwork.
Yes, yeah, and actually I looked it up. That term was actually standard until the 1970s, and by say when any general who had fought in World War II, that was the term they used, and journalists would use that term too for the enemy in World War II. The slur for Japanese, which I won't repeat. You shouldn't repeat slurs unless you have a very good reason to do so, and I don't think there's a good enough one. I mean, everyone knows them, so. But yeah, so yes, he did see the Japanese that way. Let me think, and I mean. The only thing I can say about that, though, is that it's, as I pointed out, in the town and the city, the people did notice this in reviews. They said, this is funny, because this is a novel written by a novelist who grew up in the Depression, but it's not about the Depression, which is what everyone else writes about. And he said, but this World War II is the event that scatters the Martin family. And I think, I'm not sure if that's exactly addressing what you're thinking, but yes, he does see the World War as something that sends people scattering everywhere. Would anyone else who, I mean, I'm sure many people in this room know Kerouac backwards and forwards. Can anyone address that question? All right, well, anyway, further then? Yes. Yes.
I want to look back to your,
Sure.
at the beginning, you were talking about the Franco-American, French-Canadian.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
What memory that brought up, it's at least 20 years ago. It was Roger Brudell, Paul Marion, and myself, and one other person, might have been you, Jim, I can't remember. We were trying to get, even though I'm not even a resident of Massachusetts, we were trying to get a Jack Kerouac Day proclaimed for the state of Massachusetts. In order to do that, we had to testify before some little subcommittee of the Massachusetts legislature. As we were going on, we all had our prepared statements there, and we're talking, and we would use the word French-Canadian.
Okay, yeah.
Held up a French-Canadian experience, you know, all this. At some point in the exchange, one of the legislators on the panel asked we would use the term Franco-American instead of French.
Yeah, I think that was it. It was always I mean, that's the thing. We are American. We are Americans was the idea, because that's what the term that Dexter uses in the Nation article. And but he actually kind of mocks it. He says they use this term. They prefer the hyphenated term to being Americans, but they wanted to say both. It was the idea, you know, 4 hours in French, 4 hours in English in parochial school, so that you would have full fluency and be fully aware of your heritage, and sufficiently fluent in English and educated to become established in American society. That was the whole idea.
Right. So to make sure that they would keep listening to us, we switched off to Franco-American so we could keep going.
Yeah. No, it's a funny thing, and I think it's funny because I think that Kerouac mainly said French-Canadian, and I think he may have seen Well, it's hard to say because he definitely thought of himself as an American. I mean, I'm not saying, and in fact, that's what I want to emphasize. When I talk about immigration in other countries. I mean, Jack, I think he saw himself as very much American, and I think but what he was fascinated with about America, which then included the bordering countries, Canada and Mexico, that they always come up in his books as a crossroads of global migration. So yes.
So I recall, earlier this year when Pope Leo was elected Pope, it got kind of revealed that it seems like almost every American of French extraction is somehow related to him. I was seeing articles that somehow, Jack Kerouac is related to Pope Leo.
Yeah, is that right? Yeah.
Do we know exactly what the connection is?
No, I don't. But an interesting connection is because Quebec. I mean, most people know Quebec had a separatist movement to try to be, and they've never quite managed to sever themselves from Canada. I mean, mainly for economic reasons, it would be very difficult. But then they talked about sovereignty and so forth, and the Parti Québécois, the Québécois Party. Arose in the 1960s after the Révolution, long story, Révolution Tranquille, and the first prime minister of Quebec from the Separatist Party, elected from the Parti Québécois, the first Separatist prime minister was René Lévesque, who was a second cousin of Gabriel Lévesque Kerouac. It's curious. I mean, this isn't the Pope, but this is a very interesting connection to someone very, very prominent. Yes,
and
JC.
René Lévesque was born in 1922.
Yeah. Okay, that's right.
It's
Yeah.
divergent path,
Yeah.
René Lévesque, the father of sovereignty in Quebec.
Right.
The same year as Kerouac, who tries to keep his heritage alive in America.
Yes. Yeah. And he did. I think he knew that he no, because René Lévesque was elected after he died, so he may not have known about anyone.
He knew when he goes to Quebec in '67. He talks about Chaput and the guy who was much more radical, who was with the FLQ. And stuff. He enjoys the fact that Joe Chaput is his driver, and that they strike fear in the hearts of the locals because of their last names, Kerouac and Chaput. As radicals.
Yeah. So let me see, because from what I can tell, he didn't know very much about. Actually, Quebec was very mythological to him until he went there, and then he found out a lot that he absolutely loved. Is that right? He didn't really know much about Quebecois politics.
He was aware of some of it in his late friendship with Wernig. Wernig was involved in the sovereignty movement for the Bretons. That got him all excited and thinking about Quebec, and those final year trips, he started paying into letters. And
And speaking of the Breton sovereignty, because when he traveled to Paris, he bought a pretty established Histoire de Bretagne, the history of Brittany, and read the whole thing. The copy is in the New York Public Library. And the place he underlines with big bright stars on the side is that during the French Revolution, the Bretons actually fought against the Revolutionary Army to preserve their language. Yes, because it was it's a Celtic language. And at the time of the Revolution, only 10% of the population of France spoke French as a first language. And according to the Revolution, speaking in a foreign language that we French couldn't understand was counter-revolutionary. And yes, and the Bretons, they actually fought to keep their language, and that's the passage that Kerouac underlines in stars in that book, curiously enough. So he saw that connection between Breton sovereignty historically and Quebecois sovereignty. Yeah. They're fighting, or the French of New England preserving their language too. Yeah. So. Okay. Further questions, comments? Yes.
How important was contemporary French culture for Kerouac?
Well, he loved French literature. He was very aware of he read. Let me see. Who were some of the contemporary French authors he read? He was aware of the avant-gardes. He was aware of the surrealists. He was aware of André Breton, who was still writing at the time, and a few other. Céline and Proust was one of his major writers who was dead at that time, but was still pretty contemporary.
Not really Sartre.
No, he mentioned Sartre, I think, once, somewhere. And he mentions Heidegger, too, and he actually seems to have read Heidegger, curiously enough. I mean, it's just, he just read But yeah, he was certainly aware of French avant-garde. He didn't know, I mean, there was a thriving Québécois literature, but he didn't seem to know anything about that. He never mentions a Québécois author, I don't think, does he?
Well, he does in some letters with Rosard Dion de Bay.
Yeah, yes. Right, yes, yeah.
He writes about a couple of, Marcel Dubé, a poet.
Right, okay,
a couple
yeah.
of other authors,
Yeah.
and they have a bit of an exchange about who might be. It's interesting to see the names that they name because those go on to be important figures in Quebec. But those are the only letters I found from the 50s where he's already talking about.
But curiously enough, also, I keep saying that, but it's all these. I mean, researching Kerouac was so much fun because it's like every 5 minutes, like, whoa, this is a revelation. I read through. I just flipped through as many. Tony got me them. I think the issues of L'Étoile, of Lowell, and I just, of course you can't read it cover to cover, but I just looked for interesting headlines and articles, and I kept finding articles from the 30s and stuff like that about Corneille, about Balzac, nos auteurs. And I think I think those were articles coming from Montreal papers, but that was because there was a strong identification with France and French literature. And Kerouac speaks about an aunt who was very well read in Balzac and Flaubert and all the 19th century. Yeah. So he was very interested. He did have that connection with France, but mainly because of the Québécois identification with France. But then also, because he was interested in literary avant-gardes, he was interested in a few contemporary French writers. Yeah. So, yes.
I could add something. According to my mom, who was in French class with Jack Kerouac.
Really?
High.
Really?
According to her, they were exposed to French literature.
Yes. Yeah.
So when he was in high school.
Yes. Yeah. I don't doubt it. I know very little about his high school education. I do know that he actually did. When Columbia admitted him, they didn't think he had had enough credits in French, and that was one of the subjects they sent him to Horace Mann to make up. Curiously, it's just and also because he spoke with the accent, and I think around here because I know in Worcester, I spoke with somebody. I mentioned Wilfrid Beaulieu, who was the publisher of Le Travailleur in Worcester. Which was the French language weekly that published until 1978, as late as that. I mean, I was a grown-up already at that point. I was able to buy beer legally at that point. It's 1978, still French speakers, and it was pretty much funded by his wife, Madame Beaulieu, who was a French teacher in the Worcester public schools. And I met somebody at Assumption College who'd had her. The thing is, it's just what I learned. And French had legs in Connecticut because there were so many heritage speakers, but the French we learned was the French that people learned in Paris instead, and the accent is quite different. But I think because I know Madame Beaulieu spoke with the Québécois accent, the rolled R. Is it Paris? You say in French, Paris. You say. I can't. I don't want to imitate a Québécois accent. Could you please get?
Paris.
Yes, thank you. All right, yeah, thanks. All right. Yeah. Okay, I feel like one of those. Yeah, no, I don't want to sound like one of those. I don't want to sound like Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins. I don't want to make that mistake. So yeah, so. And when I try to do Québécois, that's exactly what I sound like. I'm channeling Dick Van Dyke. And when I was 5, Bert was one of my heroes. In fact, the girl I was in love with at kindergarten, we used to play Mary Poppins and Bert together. So, so anyway, sorry. Big digressions, but all right. She was the minister's daughter, actually, and her parent. It was a congregational church. We used to play doctor up in the attic, and her parents never stopped us. They never once said anything. They knew exactly what we were doing. They were really cool. I mean, it was. So, yes. All right, more information than you needed, I'm sure. All right. So, okay, more questions coming? Yes. Yeah.
So about language, my wife had 8 years of French, high school and college.
Yeah.
Lived at the French dorm in college, and she had difficulty understanding Québécois.
Yes. Yeah.
She was taught Parisian French.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
She
Yeah.
that, but when French Canadians or Franco-Americans talk, she had difficulty understanding.
Yeah, and actually, you know, one of the reasons I did well with Jack's French is it was just before I started the research on it. For 3 years in Willimantic, Connecticut, I had a landlord from Quebec who had immigrated. He was a working class guy who'd immigrated in 1965, and he spoke exactly that French. And I was the only one of his tenants who spoke French, and we used to speak French all the time, you know. And then I got to be able to understand the accent. So when I began listening to Kerouac's Québécois French, and that's how I was able to understand. I mean, it is that different. But people talk about it as being kind of the difference between an Oxford-Cambridge accent in English and a Kentucky Mountain accent in English. People talk about it as being that different, you know. Was that about, would you say that's roughly?
Yeah, I mean,
Jack's,
it's a dialect. It's kind of like it's a creolized French.
Right, yeah. And
a French person will have a hard time understanding Creole.
Yeah, sure, yeah. And I'm avoiding, people have heard the word joual, and I tend to avoid that because that was not a word actually in widespread use even in Quebec until 1959. I did a Google book search for it, just like what it barely turns up until 1959, and then it explodes.
Yeah, and he only says Québécois once in Desolation Angels.
That's
a very new term then.
He says Canucois also several times. Canucois, I love that one. Canuck, but Canucois. Yeah, medieval French. Okay, yes, you have your hand up.
Oh, well, just funny story. I mean, my background is French Canadian on both sides, but my parents never spoke it at home.
Yeah.
I think they would have had a hard time. They were of the generation that understood, but for whatever reason, school, job, or growing up in a non-French neighborhood, they didn't speak it. So I didn't. The only time I heard it was when we went to visit my grandmother on Sundays. And at this point, I was in high school. I took 3 years of French in high school and then 2 in college. And I would sit there saying to myself, why do I not understand a single thing that my grandmother is saying? And then one day, the light bulb came on when she was saying something where I had to recognize she was saying the word moi, except that she was saying mouais. And then it dawned on me it's a whole different sound.
There's phonetics. A lot of the vowels are pronounced somewhat to a lot differently. Than in the two versions of the language, and that's evolution. I mean, because we don't know exactly what 16th, 17th century French sounded like. And apparently many of the migrants were pretty well-educated people, so they spoke the same French as you would have found among educated people in France, but you know, in over 300 years, things change. Yes,
Jean, thinking about that pronunciation, Louis XIV, when he said "L'État c'est moi," he actually said "L'État c'est moi."
Actually, yes, because you can find that in the because I read a lot. I'm actually a specialist in 16th century French, which and that's the thing. The first time I heard the name of the author, the great 16th century author François Rabelais, was in Kerouac. That's the first time I read about him, and I've taught his books many times. And you can tell, if you read poetry, you can tell from the rhymes that a lot of the phonetics in the 16th century was closer to current Québécois French than to current Parisian French right now. So it's same as with when you read Shakespeare, you can often tell from the rhymes that the pronunciations were different then.
It's a result of the colonization. The colonists keep the motherland's language longer in the that evolves, but so it takes a completely different
And then there was the idea, which Jack accepted, that they were still speaking pre-revolutionary French. I traced that idea. There's a I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. Too many books. I've read too many books. No, there's a great Québécois linguist who's actually studied the history of that, and apparently that idea only dates to the beginning of the 20th century. That this is a much older French. But that's the thing. That's one of the reasons Kerouac liked Rabelais. He saw in Rabelais a fellow French speaker at the time who swore a lot. He thought Rabelais was a lot like because. And I recognized it because I taught the book so many times, when he actually has this dialogue in a French-Canadian bar in Lowell, going back and forth. I said, this is almost a transcription of Rabelais' A Drunken Scene in Rabelais. And I found his copy of the English translation of Rabelais in the New York Public Library, and yes, it was exactly that passage he'd marked. So, and then also François Villon, the medieval French poet, the late 15th century French poet, who had a master's degree in literature from the Sorbonne, and was arrested for theft, and writes about alcohol, okay? And Rabelais also. Kerouac said that, I mean, David Amram wrote a wonderful thing about how Jack said, in Lowell, the bars were a continuation of our communion. And this is almost straight out of Rabelais. There's one of the heroes of Rabelais' book is brother John, Frère Jean. And when somebody says, when it's time in the monastery where they live for the divine service, le service divin, he says, oh, the service du vin, the service of wine, you know, because that's what he wants to do. He wants to drink, and Kerouac declared him in a paper. It's in the New York Public Library archive. One of his heroes, Frère Jean. And yeah, so the French ties are interesting, and this gravitation toward the late medieval and Renaissance French, curiously enough. So, yes, other questions, comments, please. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of that, on the French thing, I'm doing a curious thing since it sounds like some people here from France or whatever that might know this, but I don't know. When I grew up in Little Canada, and I didn't speak French myself, my family did and everything, but the one thing we all did was we knew how to swear in French. and the new kids that came from Quebec knew how to swear in English. But the thing about the swears, what I'm curious about is that I was wondering if this was just a French-Canadian thing or if it originated from France. But there used to be, my uncle and everything used to, the biggest swears they could say would be Christa Tabernac.
Yeah, that is actually specifically
Quebecois. He used to say, don't ever let a priest hear you say that. Ciboy. And I mean, for the longest time I was trying to find out what that was, and I think it was Paul Marion told me that it was an instrument that they used to hold under you for communion or something.
Yeah.
So I was curious about whether or not, since those seem to be like clerical kind of related, whether it was
an
anti-clerical bent,
or mot de Christ de baptême. Is that right? Mot de Christ. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. He's gonna. Okay. All right. There I go. Channeling Berg. Yeah. It's
you know, it's not like a swear in English. You know.
And Kerouac includes those, and he gravitates. And he knows that they're all clerical in French Canadian, and he gravitates toward those as appear a lot. But at one point in, I'm sorry, which is this in Visions of Gerard? He talks about how foul-mouthed they are in Montreal, with almost disapproval, even though in other places he loves the language because it's so vernacular and it's so colorful and it so designates things. It's such an authentic way of speaking. He sees it, but then he complains about the foul-mouthed people on Sainte Catherine in Montreal. I mean, it's
on the TypeScript to Visions of Gerard, a lot of the things that he added by hand were French-Canadian swear words.
Yeah.
He just extends it in blue ink, like Christ, the swear de Calvaire, for his father. Like he has his father say all these extra things.
Yeah.
But I think it's there's something about swear words wherever you're from. If you hear a swear word from where you're from, you know, like, or something like your word, like Miles Davis feels about the word motherfucker. Like that's home. I always felt that if you hear someone swear in your language, someone from home is here.
Yeah, and I guess your kids have their headphones on now.
Yeah. That's why I can say that.
So my grandparents' family, who came from various parts of Europe, speak Yiddish quite well, and the only Yiddish that's come down are swear words.
Yeah.
And that's about the only thing that people of my generation can speak.
Yeah.
Swearing in Yiddish.
Yeah. My mother swore a great deal in Dutch when we were little kids, and I didn't know there were swear words. And when I repeated one, I was probably 5 or 6. I repeated one in front of my father when my mother wasn't there, and he said, "You should never say that." And I said, Mommy says it all the time. And he said, and he said, Mommy would never say anything like that. He's like, well, where did I learn this swear word from? Curious, I mean, yeah, because I don't think she did it in front of her own mother, but she did it to her kids a great deal when there were 3 of us, we were boys, you know. So, I'm sorry, hands are going up. Further questions, comments? I guess we're close to out of time. I've got a few copies of I've got about, let me see, 7 copies of my book left.
Great book.
Thank you. Yeah, $30, as I said. I mean, academic books are very expensive. I bought it. I bought it at my author's discount, which is pretty hefty, and I'm selling them at cost, which is $30.
Just pretend you're buying war bonds.
Yeah, okay. And then if we run out, if anyone wants more, Bloomsbury, the publisher, did give me a 35%, that was the lowest I could get them. They gave me a discount coupon, which I have, for 35% if we run out. I mean, I'm not assuming everyone's going to run up and buy, but that's another option too. And that doesn't quite come down to $30, but it's you know, that's shipping and tax and all of that. So anyway, all right. Anything? Yes.
Yeah, just one question in regards to you from North Carolina. Can you pontificate on the Belichick situation?
Didn't I do that enough earlier before the talk? Yeah, okay.
But not everyone.
Okay, well, I'll just put it this way. Last night I had dinner with a PhD student of mine who graduated in many years ago, and he's the football coach at Phillips Andover. And he grew up in South Carolina, lived in North Carolina for many, many years, follows UNC. And we were sitting over dinner, and I said, here, Belichick. He nearly fell off his seat laughing. That's my pontification. Yeah, I think that's all we need to know. Yeah. Okay, and I'll tell you what I told you also. It's just that, the day of the game. Well, the reason they hired him, the day of a game, you can't find even an illegal parking space in the 2 towns that the Chapel Hill area constitutes. But well before the game ends, the roads are full again. That's what it's been like. Okay, yeah, all right. Football. Yeah.